Our next speaker, when I asked him, so what did you dream of when you were a wee lad and you were staring up at the vast sky and thinking about your future? It turns out he thought at the time his future was going to be reptilian. He grew up with two parents who were researchers, and biology was their field, and he kind of imagined that perhaps snakes and lizards were going to be his thing.
I still like them.
Still likes it. But he ended up going to medical school, change of plans, as we've all had, going into sports medicine, which I thought, well, okay, that's handy, and practiced for quite a while, and the through line there, though, was always art. And he said when he realized the books by the side of his bed were art books, he thought maybe it's time to really make that the primary focus. And boy, we've all been in that place, haven't we? So he is the founder and president of Medicine Man Gallery, and I think everybody in this room knows what an amazing establishment that is. And Dr.Mark Sublette has been through many life journeys, and he's about to share another passion of his, which I'm going to let him tell you about.
Thank you. So we'll check for the sound first. Is it good? Yep, excellent. Okay. So I'm Mark Sublette, and one of the interesting things is getting to talk to a women's group, and it's really not just me who's made Medicine Man Gallery, and I think that's really important to understand that it takes two in this journey, and the other one's that one, who's also my wife, Kathleen Cunahan, who is a physician as well. So let's not leave her out, because she also helped build this just as much as I did. She doesn't like to speak. You sure you don't tonight? You sure? This could be a great opportunity. This could be the one. Yeah, exactly. They've had all women speakers. No, she's going to kill me if I continue on this route. 31 years, I know this. So I did a lecture for the Minneapolis Art Institute on Navajo Textiles, and I showed up to the, it was a big group, probably 300 people. I showed up, and the person who was going to do the AV for me and all that, they said, well, you know, we need your PowerPoint and all this. I said, I have no PowerPoint. And she just became ashen. She says, no PowerPoint? You're going to talk for an hour with no PowerPoint? I said, yeah. I said, and they're going to like it. She goes, we'll see. And then I brought all these textiles out, and I think people really can understand the art form that I'm going to talk about when you can see and feel. And some of these I'll pass around so you can actually get an opportunity to see what these textiles are all about. Some of these are very, very rare weavings. And even though I'm a man, I am going to speak for the women. And the women that I'm going to speak for are the Navajo women here, because they are basically almost all the weavers that do this are women. Very few men weave, so this is almost always done by the women. Now, I have a question for you, since most of you are artists in here. I'd like to know, I mean, you can just shout out, what's the longest time frame you've worked continuously, not stopped, had a kid, and worked on something, on a piece of art? 3 hours?
Before I took a break?
No, before it was done. That explains a lot why your paintings look like that now. I got it, okay. Has anybody spent a year on a single piece as your only piece? No. So some of these have taken at least a year to weave. So imagine the amount of time and energy and effort that goes into weaving these when the next time you're at your canvas or working on your sculpture. And these were often done, mainly done outside in very hard conditions. And they not only had to weave the weavings, but they also had to raise the media, which is the sheep. They had to raise the sheep, they had to clean the wool, they had to spin the wool, they had to do all those things to get this ready to be able to trade or sell. So when you think of these pieces, I want you to think about the time and energy and effort that went into these. So to talk about Navajo weavings, we really have to start at the beginning of diagnostic, how we know what they are, and value, and age, and all these kind of things. It really comes down to age. So where I'd like to begin is 1805, and a place called Canyon de Chelly, and that was one of the great places of the Navajos. It still is. In fact, I'm going there tomorrow to take photographs of Josh Elliott, who's going to have a show for us in March, and I'm going to take photographs of him in just that area, and it's an amazing place. It is the place where Spider Woman came to the Navajos to teach them to walk in beauty and to weave. Now, if you're a weaver, and again, these are primarily female, and back in this time, they were almost probably exclusively women. If you were going to, the day you were born, you would come out of your hogan with the sun coming into you from the east-facing door. The medicine man would be there to greet you, and he would have a spider web that he would put on your right hand and curl around your fingers. It would have hopefully dew on it because the Spider Woman represents the entire cosmos. And that weaving of the spider would give you good grace to become a weaver. That's how important it is for the Navajo for weaving, that it starts on day one of life. So take all that into consideration when you're thinking about these. So I go back to 1805, and why that date? Because that time, the Navajos did a lot of raiding. That's really how they got a lot of their trade goods, is they would go and they would raid Pueblo villages and Spanish villages. They would also trade, but they were also very easily to go in and do warfare. Garrison of Spanish soldiers found a group of mainly elderly men, women, and children in Canyon del Muerto. It was not called that then, but it soon would be, and isolated in there, shot all their muskets in there until they killed everyone. And they were all dead, and if you're Navajo or Dene, that's what they call themselves, you would not go back into this place because that would have bad spirits or shindi. The shindi are trapped, so you would stay out of it. And it stayed that way. These individuals, they're like the battleship Arizona at in Pearl Harbor. This was their Pearl Harbor for them. They knew what was going on. That's where the name Canyon de Muerto, the Canyon of Death, came from. A man named Sam Day, who was half Navajo man, in about 1900, he owned the Chinle trading post up in near Canyon du Chelly. He went into that cave, and what he pulled out were some of the textiles. And so those remnants of the textiles, because it's a dry cave, were still pretty much intact. And many of these are now in the Smithsonian, but it gives us an idea of what was being woven at that time. And that's an important thing to know. And basically, though this isn't of that vintage, this is probably 1860 to 50s time frame, it would have been just simple weaving like this. This is what we call Mochi, but this is all hand spun with little bits of red. But mainly it was just black and brown types of designs like this. This is all natural designs, natural wool. I'm going to pass it around so you can actually feel and see like that. I do expect it at the end of the lecture to come back up on this table. So that was what was being woven at that time. These were the earliest pieces in 1805. They were simple stripes, simple black and brown, and maybe some trade cloth. So here's an example of a blanket. And this one I'll put it on first, and then you can show it. Since we have video, we need good design sense. So this is a second phase chief's blanket. This is made about 1850 to 1860.
And it's a sun phase? Is that
Second phase. So the question is, so what are these phases and what are you talking about? Now you can hold that up if you don't mind. Carol Allman, one of your members and actually one of my artists, and Kathleen are going to help. So that's all natural yarns. How do I know that? Well, this red, we've actually taken little strips of that, sent it off for spectrophotometry to see what it comes out. It comes out as cochineal. Cochineal is a small little lac insect that is on the Nepal or prickly pear cactus. You'll see it around Tucson, these little white little things that look like it's fuzz. They would take those off, those little insects, and use this to form the wool. They didn't do it themselves. I'll go and tell you a little bit more about that. But that's a design. A second phase means that it's broken into a 12 pattern design. A first phase, if you imagine all these squares gone and it's just stripes, that's a first phase blanket. Those are very early and very rare. First phases are maybe less than 100, some say 50. I think it's probably closer to 100. Most are in museums, and they can be extremely valuable. And they can bring up to $2 million. These don't bring as much, but this is very early and rare. And I just want to point out one thing about this. Look how modern the design is, right? And I'm doing a show that's about to end. If you get a chance, I highly recommend you going up and seeing it, called Homage to the Square, and I did a catalog on it. And my premise in that show is, where has modernists come from and when did it begin? Was it the mid-century modernists of Albers and Donald Judd that were coming up with these interesting block-nested patterns of design? Hard to hold this, isn't it? Yeah. Or was it earlier? This is 1850 to 1860. And anyone who knows modern art, I think if you looked at a Josef Albers nested square design, you would be able to see some form of resemblance in this particular piece. So this is a second phase. First phase, simple stripes. Second phase, 12 blocks. Thank you. Next phase is third. Now, if you ever wonder where Ralph Lauren gets all those great ideas, I think you can see. This is a third phase. So this is a progression, Kathleen, if you don't mind. This is a progression of going from 12 diamonds to a 9 pattern design. This would be a little later. This is more on the 1860 to 70 time frame. Again, had it die tested, because you never know until you actually test these things what you have. And again, this turned out to be all natural dyes, so it put it at an earlier time frame. I did sell an early blanket to Ralph Lauren's people, which turned into a beautiful dress. I thought, oh, I'm going to call and order one for my wife. I think this would be fantastic. I had the blanket. They can, I'll give it to her as a gift. Well, it was sold out, and when I found out the price, it was more than what I had charged them for the blanket. So, these things still translate into today. I wore these shoes just to show you what Donald Pliner can do with a design. And then my socks also are 2 Gray Hills. I actually had the textile that they took that off of. I have no idea where they got it and how they did it, probably off the internet. Thank you very much. So that's a third phase, a classic piece. I'm going to show you one other third phase, and we'll just let you handle this one right off the bat. This is a little later. This is 1870s. Probably the dyes that we tested were natural. There may be some synthetic too, but all the ones I tested were natural. The blue is indigo, which again will never fade. You can see that it's becoming more compact. There's more design filling itself in. So it goes from simple stripes to 12 boxes to 9 diamonds or boxes, and now it's becoming to even fill the center of the entire field. But beautiful art. Again, probably took about a year to make this. Thank you. So these early blankets, like that second phase blanket, they would have been worth 50 horses in the 1850s, or $25 in gold. It was the most valuable textile in North America. So these were very valuable pieces, and they were meant to be traded. They made them to be traded. In fact, the term chief's blanket is a misnomer. It's a misnomer in that the Navajos have no chiefs. They're a tribal of the clan tribe, and so when the cavalry came out and they saw people like Chief Joseph, Plains Indians, with these beautiful blankets on them, these blankets, which they had been traded for horses, they said, those are chief's blankets. Only the chiefs wear those. So that's where the term comes from. It's a misnomer, actually. Other blankets that you will see that are early, this is what we call the classic time frame. The second phase was a classic. This is also a classic. So this is 1860s. Yeah, look at that, right? Isn't that fantastic? That's definitely took a year to weave. In the museum downstairs, you'll see one that Kathleen and I donated a few years back that's a classic as well. And it's just amazing. So where did they get the red, right? Right? They got it from this. Okay, this is trade cloth. This is bayeta. And they would unravel each one of these little strings and either pair it or triple it to get this. Now imagine that before you start to weave. The next time you put your canvas up and ready to paint. This is what goes into doing this. This is indigo, which is a dyed plant source, and it's just an amazing thing. And that one's pretty much in perfect condition. Probably the reason it's in perfect condition is that these things were often collected by the cavalry. They were expensive then, and they were coming in to this area, and they would want them as well. That would have been a very expensive blanket to buy. In fact, even at the turn of the century, a man like William Randolph Hearst, one of the wealthiest men in the world, he would pay up to $1,500 at the turn of the century for one of these. Now, that may not sound like a lot, but think of those in those terms when you could get a meal in a good hotel for maybe $1. Talking about the cavalry, I think we have to talk a little bit about what happened to the Navajos, and these classic that we're talking about, they changed. So does anyone in this room know what the long walk is? Okay, so we have 1 person, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's not bad. That's pretty good, actually. Most people don't know about it. And it's American history. I grew up in New Mexico, and I can assure you it wasn't taught in my history class. And it should have been, especially since I grew up less than an hour away from where it all occurred, which is in Bosque Redondo, which is in Fort Sumner, New Mexico. So what happened in 1863, we have a couple things going on. One, we have the Civil War. And the Civil War was starting to be won by the North and soon would be over. But we had a problem with, or a perceived problem, and maybe it was a problem, but at least a very seriously perceived problem of the Indian problem in New Mexico, which was the Navajos and the Apache. And so one of the generals said the best way to get rid of this problem is to exterminate the Navajos, literally exterminate them. But they thought it was unrealistic because they're a clan society and they're all over the place, that it would be very difficult to kill them out like vermin, which is amazing, but these are terms that they would use. So by 1864, as the Civil War again starts to wind down, they realize that they're going to get rid of the Navajo problem, and they're going to do it in the same fashion that they did Atlanta. They're going to burn and slash and destroy everything and basically starve them into submission. And that's exactly what they did. They starved them into submission. They went into Canyon de Chelly, where I'm going to be tomorrow, and they cut down their 100-year-old apple, an orange, or their peach trees. They cut them all down. Any sheep they killed, any hogans they had, they destroyed. It's a very interesting story in Canyon de Chelly. If you haven't been there, you should. Again, that's Spider Woman Rock is there, and that's where they believe they were learned to be able to weave. So in Canyon de Chelly, there's a rock called Fortress Rock, and it's 700 feet high. And the Navajos knew that Kit Carson was the one who was called upon to do this. Sherman actually said, we need Kit Carson. Carson really wasn't, he didn't really want to do this. He was in retirement. He's married to a Native American and living in Taos, but they said, you know, you're a good American and you need to take charge of this. So he brought the garrison of cavalry from New Mexico to take care of the issue. On this Fortress Rock, the Navajos realized that they were coming, so they took food and they put it on the top of this mesa, which you can't get to. It's 700 feet. And then they built big barriers of rock so if they shot up that they could be safe. And sure enough, they couldn't get to them. And what the Navajos will tell you that they did to get water, because they figured the cavalry just said, that's fine, we'll just stay below and we'll starve you out. But they didn't realize they had put all the food up there, and they had also, what they would do at night, they would go, and when they ran out of water, they would make a human chain, one upon the other, until they got down to the bottom. They would get some water and bring it up. So finally, the military actually ran out of water and food, or food, not water, and they moved on. Ultimately, they came back and they got them. And so what happened in 1864, this was in January of 1864, they basically starved them out. And 9,000 Navajos surrendered. And over 53 different trips, they marched them, and they started in March of 1864 in the winter, and they marched them to Fort Sumner, 500 miles away, forced march, women, children, kids. And if you couldn't keep up, you were shot. You were just taken to the side. If you were pregnant and couldn't make it, you're done. And they had about 200 people die along the way, just along the way. And then once they got to Fort Sumner, they were kept there for 4 years. And during that period of time, they did very little weaving, actually. They had almost complete 100% child mortality, it was really not a good situation. So one of the weavings that was done would have been this weaving, which is a bosque weaving. We call this bosque redondo because it has the colors, the size. You'll notice it's odd size. The odd size is much more in shape with a Mexican, or a New Mexican, I should say, textile. So the shape is much more in that size. The coloration were the yarns that they would get. These are all three-plied natural yarns. So that's was done at that time frame. So when you look at this is what was happening when they had this woven. This was probably done at Fort Defiance, actually. At Fort Defiance, they did have some weavers there that were weaving for the cavalry, though they developed severe syphilis in that area, and they shipped them all off to Bosque as well. Thank you. So all the people stayed at the Bosque, and they were there for 4 years, and it was a big disaster. And they knew it was a disaster. The military knew it was a disaster. So what are they going to do with these people? They've been taken away from their 4 sacred mountains. And they say, I know, let's ship them to Florida. And that's what they were going to do. And they said, no, you can't take us away from Dinatah. We need to go back. We'll be good humans. Don't take us. So a group of the chieftains, Manuelito and Barbacito, went to Washington, and they made an agreement that they would be good humans, and that they would go to Indian. Their children for the next 10 years would be taught English. They would go to boarding schools to become good Americans. By the way, I have a letter written in 1864 from a sergeant that was at Fort Defiance, where he writes that we will kill any man, woman, or child that has arms against us, and we'll turn them into good Christians. And so that was the attitude that they were dealing with. They did let them go. They said, okay, if you'll be good and go to the reservation, we will let you go, and you can go back to Dinatah. This little piece that I showed you earlier, which was the kind of pieces that were coming out of the red, unraveled, this came from Sam Days Jr.'s collection. He brought it to me one time. This went all the way to Bosque Redondo and back. This piece right here, that particular piece. So even though it's a commercially made trade cloth, it has great importance to me and to the people that went on that trip. And he said, I heard that I bought this 20 years ago from him. He goes, I heard you would be the man for it. I said, yes, no, I'll take care of it. So that went all the way to that and stayed there. So they come back, and now we're changing. So this all affects what textiles. Let's get back to textiles. So these pre-1864 textiles are what we call classic periods. That's before they were involved with the military and getting Hispanic blankets. You can see what happens on the one that they had that's narrow. That starts to change it. We call it a Bosque piece. You have pieces like this, which is kind of a late classic. So this is still raveled beata, raveled yarn, natural dyes, but this is more 1870s time frame. Still a beautiful object. So we call this a late classic period. And that's good. And then you'd start to see other things that are interesting. This is also from that same kind of a time frame. This is one of the earliest pieces that you'll ever see like this. This actually has, take that in, it has a design in the middle. And if you'll notice the design, yeah, right? It's a United States shield that you'd see on the early nickels, I think, the 3-cent nickel, or the 5-cent nickel, and a 3-cent piece. MR, could be a cavalry guy, probably was. Now, so the Navajos at this point in time, this is 1870s, it's all raveled, these are natural yarns, but the Navajos at this time frame wouldn't really know what that is, but they would know it has significance, it had some kind of symbolism that was important to the Belaganas or the whites, and so she put it prominently in there. And it could have even been done as some sort of commission. Again, they're not going to speak English. There's a lot of the grandmothers that don't write or read now, as it is. So that's a very early pictorial, thank you. And you'll also see other pictorials that are done. This is one that was done, now that's 1870s. So this is one that's done. This is going to be, I write murder mysteries, the Charles Bloom murder mysteries. Some of you may be fans, some of you may hate my things, I don't know. But this is going to be the cover, actually, for my next book, which is called Indian School Days, and it starts in the boarding school days starting in 1961. And this was done 1890. And that's what that is. It's a boarding school. And this would have gone and been sold to tourists off the train, probably not by the Navajos, but more like somebody like Fred Harvey. But it's a great little early piece, and I think it's going to make a wonderful cover. In fact, I know it will. That comes out in March, by the way. And you have other pictorials that would have been done, very kind of crude, cow, horse, you name it. This is turn of the century. So they're starting to do things more for the tourist trade. And so why is that? So 1876, a man named Lorenzo Hubble comes and opens the Hubble Trading Post. And he's very entrepreneurial. He sees the Navajos, what they're doing now. They're on the reservation. They can't raid like they used to. So they really have to focus in on making blankets, textiles. The textiles they're making this time are blankets, right? 1876, just like that red one that we showed you with the stripes. They were making these kind of things. It didn't take long, within about 20 years, by turn of the century, 1890s, they were saying, the traders were saying, and they're all popping up all over the reservation saying, listen, we don't want blankets. Nobody wants blankets. They can go buy a commercial Pendleton blanket, but they do want rugs. So they started to do this transition from blankets you'd wear to things that you would actually put on the floor. Just to show you a couple things that you would see. We talked about the third phase. Well, this is a transitional third phase. So this is 1890s. It could have been worn. It also could have been made for trade. Again, that's 1890s. The blue on it is probably not indigo. It looks to be a chrome blue. They weren't using indigo. By about 1880s, you wouldn't see any more of the indigo. So that dates right to 1890. So that's a transitional period. Thank you. You also have pieces like this, which I love. This is a turn of the century. So when you're a Navajo and the traders are saying, I don't want blankets, we want rugs, what are they going to say? They're going to go, well, what's a rug? Well, a rug has a border. Oh, okay. I'll put a little border. So there's a teeny little border around it. But then look at this design. Now, this is very unusual. So it's just all squares. She's using her own artistic design for this piece. You know, again, this is that homage to the square type of thing. This is unusual. It's not typical. But I wanted to show you some of the things that, from a creative point of view, what they could do. Thank you. Another transitional piece, which is this. We'll show a couple. Another unusual one, right? Remember the squares we saw in the second phase? Well, now you have an 1890s blanket. Again, look at the art. I mean, that's modern art, right? You see that, you think that's definitely modern art. Well, guess what, folks? That's 1890s. And it was, again, made as a blanket. It's a blanket weight. I could wear it. It would look very different. In fact, it will look very different. Thank you. If I put it on, it'll have a different sensibility. Very much so. But at this point in the 1890s, the traders are again saying, listen, how about let's make some things that aren't really blankets. Let's go for some other stuff. They would do things like this. This is what we call kind of just a simple daogi piece. Again, 1890s, transitional piece. The transitional time frame is really about that 1880 to turn of the century. And now for one of my favorites, because I would have loved to sit down and had dinner with this gal, because she had a sense of design and color and artistic expression, and I would have given her first place for sure.
It's beautiful.
It's so different, it's so unique. You know, they said you wanted something different than blankets. Well, this is what I envisioned. And I can only imagine the trader, when she brought this in to sell it, going, what is this? Not unlike probably the modernist artists when they brought it into their dealers and said, look at what I've come up with. We call it abstract expressionist. So that's a very different kind of a piece. It's a wonderful example of what the creative genius of these women are.
What date was this?
That's 1890s.
So were those all hand-dyed too?
So those, it's all hand spun. Some of the dyes are natural, some of them are aniline. By this time frame, there really aren't many natural, there's no real reds or blues that are being used by that. You also have things like this. Wow, right? Pop art. In fact, people like Andy Warhol and the people from that pop generation of the 60s really gravitated to these and collected these. So in the 1890s, they could get what's called Germantown dyes and yarns. This was a commercial blank. The yarns are commercially made in Germantown, Pennsylvania. They were shipped to the Navajo reservation, and if you were very talented as a weaver, you could afford to buy the yarn, and then you could go crazy. You could do whatever you wanted to. Imagine how hard that would have been to try to do with hand-spun yarn before then. So you see some of these what we call eye dazzlers. They're actually usually done on a cotton warp, and they don't take as much time to weave, actually, because 40% of the time involved in making one of these things is wool preparation. So you have to remember that's a big part of the deal. You also have things like child's blankets. This is really more a adolescent blanket. This is a late classic 1870s. This would have been for a young woman probably, or a small woman. All natural blues. The indigo's all natural blues. The reds and this one are flannel, I believe. Beautiful object. This one I just bought a couple days ago. It's kind of an 1880s, 70s. Look how beautiful that is. The blue in it's natural. It's just simple design, but wonderful. And the crosses really probably represent a Spider-Woman cross, is what that is. And that's a child's blanket. Then you have things like this that were also made, saddle blankets, right? That's done at T-Snow's Post. You see all the stuff at the end. This is what we call a Sunday saddle. They call that because you would take this when you went into town for Sunday school. You know, you would put the back end of the horse. This would be behind it. These weren't used much, really. They were probably more special and often, you know, especially one like this that still has all the original tassels, probably didn't see too much of the horse. But this is about 1920s, 20s. We have any car buffs out here? Oh, good. That means you get to tell me the date on this, because if you're a GM guy, you'd be able to look at that and tell you. Nope. 56. Now, I wouldn't have known that, I can assure you, but car guys came in, truck guys, and said, oh, this kind of window here, they said this kind of certain thing here was 56, and the way they did the bumper was 56. So yeah, this is 56. So, and they knew exactly. More than one had said, and I was like, wow, okay. Then you have things like this, which is also pictorial. This is where you see folk art, really. This is a good example of folk art and Navajo weavings bisecting. This is turn of the century. It's kind of a quilt pattern almost. Could have been inspired with a quilt pattern, but she did her own horses. This was made in the Crystal trading posts. Again, all these trading posts kind of developed their own styles for that area. And Crystal liked a lot of natural design, natural colors and interesting designs. You have another one. Why don't you grab that end? Carolyn, you guys can show that one. This is a runner. So to make this is all natural wool. It's all hand spun. This is 1910. Tell you a quick little story. I had a lady who came in to my gallery 15 years ago probably, and she took a rug like this and threw it on the table. She said, how old is it? And I said, well, it's Crystal. It looks to be about 1905, 1910. She goes, exactly. She goes, it was made in 1907. You get to sell my rug. You know what you're doing. And there's certain colors and designs and yarns that you can see that are used at different time frames, and you can get within about a 10-year period, usually, sometimes a little closer, of when these things were made, and that's going to be like a 1910 weaving. This was done as a commission, undoubtedly, because no Navajo is going to make a runner just to make it. Trader would have come to probably one of the better weavers, and if you're dying with your arms, you can let them down. And that's really hard, by the way, what they're doing. It doesn't look like it, but I can assure you, after 26 years of doing this, I can tell you that is not easy, and I appreciate that. But so the trader would come to one of their better weavers and say, I have somebody who wants this size. Basically, he might say this kind of design, or he might just say, we know you're going to do a great design, you always do. And they would support the weaver for about anywhere between 8 months. Probably in that case, it might take 8 months to weave. That weaver could come in, and they could get money, they could get goods, and they might keep a bill, just a credit. And they still do this in some places. It's very interesting. I went out to Totalina, which is where I write my murder mysteries, are sad in Totalina. And I interviewed a famous lady who was a great old weaver and on film. And I asked her, I said, so tell me why you weave. What is it, why you weave? And anybody care to guess what she told me? Say it again.
Money.
So what that weaver told me, she goes, for the money, dummy. That's exactly right. So she went on and expressed that there was other things involved, Spider Woman, this was important to her culture, and that's what she did. But the bottom line is that this has always been made as a trade item, whether it was to the Plains Indians or whether it was to the traders or whether it's now on the internet. This is where you got your tennis shoes for your grandkids. This is where you got your new pickup truck. In fact, speaking of pickup trucks, you could have something like this. Virginia Deal, who was on the cover of Arizona Highways in 1974, and she traded a textile like this for a pickup truck. She should have kept the rug because it would have done better. That took her 18 months to make. It's about 80 wefts per the inch. It's got, I think, something like 12 different color pools. It's all hand spun. So that's a masterpiece. Virginia is no longer with us, but she was one of the greats. And that segues to, are they still doing it? Well, yes, they are. Now, not everyone is a Virginia Deal because it takes a lifetime. First, you have to be graced with Spider Woman's gift, and you have to embrace it. And then you have to be able to spend a lifetime doing this. She finished this up, she was probably about 83 when she finished this up. So she started about when she was 80. And that was their second to last great textile that she did. There's another lady, that's good, thank you, named Daisy Tlagalchi, who was a very famous weaver. I liked what she did so much that I wrote a book about her in one of my murder mysteries. I placed the whole murder mystery about her textile. It's called Kayenta Crossing. She won first in Gallup International 20 years in a row. So if you're talking about excellence, she was the Tiger Woods of weavers. And so these women still are alive, they're still weaving. This is just one example of something, this is not new. This is done probably in the 30s time frame. It's a T-Snos post. One of the things that makes it so exceptional is these round design elements. This requires an eccentric weave. So when you weave, you can do things like this, right? But to do this, that's really thinking outside the box, and these are just fantastic. So this was definitely a master weaver, and we can tell that this is from that region, T-Snos post. Thank you. So as an overview, when you think of these weavings, when you see them, don't just think of them as arts and crafts. I think we've shown you that they're not, that they're art, and that these weavers were artisans, and they had their own vision. They incorporated their art sense and their design with their weavings, as well as their heritage and what they had learned about weaving through Spider Woman's gifts. And that's the basis of Navajo Textiles. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Yes?
We got to get the microphone.
We have to get the microphone. Mr. Microphone. Thanks. By the way, why don't we lay these out so people can come by and look at them. You're welcome to look at them. If you had a sticky food for lunch, just look. Or go to the restroom and wash your hands. Otherwise, you're welcome to touch, because I think this is textile art. And you need to be able to touch these things to understand them. In my house where I have these, I don't go by a weaving and not take my hand and do this to it. It brings me to the art, it brings me to the feel, the textile. And when I'm looking to buy these or date these, I have to feel the wool because different types of wool were done in different areas. Like churro wool is the earliest. So you'll notice on these very early ones, maybe they can put the earliest ones at this end, have a different kind of a feel because they're blankets. They were made as blankets. First question.
I was wondering about the age that a Navajo girl would be started into this by her mother or aunt or brother. They would actually start teaching them at a very young age.
It's a language.
Okay.
It's just like a language.
And did all Navajo Weavers teach their daughters?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the majority did weave. Yeah, that's how you made your living. The men would make the tools, usually out of juniper. They would have an outdoor loom made out of juniper, and the women would weave. There are some men that would weave, but it was very uncommon. There's many more men weaving today than there were in the past, and some of the great weavers today, contemporarily, are men.
I have a couple questions. Everybody ready?
Stand up, please.
Excuse me. Interesting that you talk about the phases of the design. As artists, weren't there women that said, I don't want to do that design, I want to do
Absolutely.
something else?
Absolutely. So the question is, were they stuck into doing a certain type of weaving? The answer is no, these are artists. Some would and some wouldn't. But if everybody wants a third phase or a wider than long blanket, and that's what people are interested in, and we know it's for the money dummy, that you're going to probably do it in that style.
Okay, and also, why did they quit using the natural blue? It's a much more constant color than...
Harder to get, and they could. So in 1856, a man named William Perkins invented coal tar dyes in England. It completely changed the way that we see color and what we did as a world. And by 1856, before that, cochineal was the #1 or #2 produce out of places like Guatemala and things like that. Once coal tar dyes came in vogue, were able to be made cheaply, the Germans took over, ran that industry, and we know by 1866, the first synthetic dyes, Chief White Antelope Blanket, who was a Cheyenne warrior who had a Navajo textile, had synthetic dyes. So even as early as 1866, just 10 years later, you were starting to see aniline dyes get to the rest. Because one thing, they would come in plied yarns, which were very tight, some of them, which you could use, and the variety of color. And they were, to some extent, inexpensive. It takes a lot of work and effort to go out and collect certain dye to do that. Yes?
So along those lines, the dye that came from the bug, when I squish that bug, it's like a bright pink crimson. So have the colors changed quite a bit over the years? How do they last?
No, and they're still using cochineal. So if you'll find that trade cloth that came from along the Sam Day II, all the way from Las Redondas.
To that color?
So that color of that exact piece, which we're going to bring out, that's where they got these reds. They weren't doing the dyeing themselves, okay? So this either would come over through the Camino Real from Mexico, or earlier on, it would have come through, it could have come through Spain, and they had a different kind of dye, which is a related to the lac. It's also a very small parasite, which to the cochineal, which is lac. So this is where they got these, is through trade cloths. They did not do it themselves.
Okay. And so the colors we see today,
Yes?
do you feel like they would have been similar back then? Like,
Oh yeah.
okay.
Yeah. In fact, I can.
Yeah,
These are color fast, right? These are color fast. I could take this out and put it in the sun, even the Arizona sun, and it's going to still look like that. So that's exactly what this would have been. This is an indigo dye. This is an indigo dye. They don't really fade, especially indigo. One of the ways we know if it's indigo is you can just open up the yarns a little bit and look inside. If there's any fading at all, just even the slightest bit, that's not indigo. That is something, that's a chrome dye. Indigo was a plant dye. And those they would get in blocks and they would make. And they're using these things now. Now, today, there are weavers who are doing cochineal, they're doing indigo and doing these kind of things, for sure. This is a really rare and beautiful blanket. I highly encourage you getting to touch it before I take it back home. Yes?
I just want to ask, the reds seem to change so much, and I realize that they're interwoven, the trade cloth is interwoven with another. Well, why would, like the one that you were holding just now, that one, the reds be so like kind of pink?
It just has to do with so cochineal. So the question is, why is this, say, more of a pinky color than, put on my glasses, yay, versus this, which is also cochineal, which is more of a red color. So it's a spectrum. This is also cochineal. These are all the same colors, all the same dye, which is cochineal, not the same colors. And it depends on the mordant. So what they mixed it with, it could be anywhere from a very light pink to a very dark burgundy. So it depends how the cochineal was mixed and the trade colors, because you want different colors, right? Everybody wants different spectrum. Cochineal has been a very important source of color dye for centuries. And in central Mexico and Central America, they became experts in raising cochineal. Different types would give different colors of dyes, so it's a very interesting. There's lots of books and things. There's actually a very good book on just cochineal. Yes?
I have a question. When did animals start appearing on the rugs, and is it rare to have them in rugs?
Right. So the question is, and you probably heard that well, is are pictorials, specifically animals, when did it occur, and is it rare? So they probably started about 1870s would have been the earliest. So right at that late classic time frame. Again, 1866, which is the documented blanket that was done, Chief White Antelope blanket, which is in the School of American Research in Santa Fe, had little birds in it. So, but you don't really see a lot of that taking hold until probably about the 1890s. What happens in the 1890s? Trains, right? The West starts to get opened up, right? So the Santa Fe Railroad opens up in 1879 in Santa Fe, it makes its way west. So people like those things. They like the iconography, they can relate to it. So right in that time frame, so you see some examples. They're not common, but, and they usually do bring a premium if they have interesting, animal forms. And I've seen all sorts of things on it. I mean, it's amazing the different things they would do. Even airplanes, when airplanes started to come in, they would go, oh my God, airplanes. This is about 1920s, and you'll see those.
And do you have a catalog of that exhibit you have?
I do,
Oh.
yeah. We did, and I didn't bring any, I probably should have, but you can order it online or go to the gallery or whatever. It's Homage to the Square, and it shows, it actually talks about modern art versus Navajo art. It has about 40 or so, maybe more like, I think it's maybe 70 illustrations of Navajo weavings, including that second phase, third phase, and it shows and talks about what I just, to some extent, told you about. But going on the bent more on modern art. There's also, I did a TV show called Los Colores, PBS, that was out of Albuquerque. If you go to PBS Albuquerque, Homage to the Square, you can see me on TV and talking about it, and also you get the Navajo perspective as well, which is an interesting thing, I think. Any other questions? Yes?
I was a few minutes late from lunch, I apologize, so maybe you already spoke about this, but I think I understood you to say that they started weaving these around the 1800s?
So the Navajos, well,
Yeah, go ahead, one question.
okay, go ahead.
And so what did they do before they started weaving blankets? How did they keep warm?
Yeah, so the question is, when did they start weaving and how do they keep warm? Well, animals, of course, have always been a source of warmth, whether it's just deer or elk. The Navajos are Athabascan, just as the Apache are. And so they came from the Bering Strait, and they were the last Native Americans to kind of come to America, somewhere in the 1350 to 1400 time frame. So we had the Spanish come over, right? And by the 1500s, there was lots of conquistadors bringing their sheep, and that's where the sheep came from. Before that, they would have used cotton. They probably also learned things from the Pueblo Indians when they came down, though they would say it's all Spider Woman that taught them, but I'm sure there was influence from the Pueblo who also wove these things, and they made cotton blankets. So the first ones were probably cotton. Those didn't survive. We know the Anasazi, the ancient ones, who have been here, you know, since 200, 400 AD, wove lots of cotton mantas, but again, they didn't have sheep. When I talk about 1805, what that refers to is that's the first known examples we can go, okay, this is what they were doing, this is what the colors look like, this is what it was. And those were simple brown and blue indigo stripes primarily, and that's from 1805. Any other questions? We want to talk about paintings now? Why there's not more women in art galleries? See? I got lots of women in mind, so don't look at me, guys. All right, thank you very much.